Hej och välkomna till Udda Ting, en podcast om sällsamma historier, kreativitet och kreatörerna själva. Mitt namn är Henrik Möller, musiken är skapad av Testbild och den fina loggan till podden är gjord av Malmökonstnären Nalle Chinsky. Det här avsnittet är en sorts komplement till Udda Ting avsnitt 2 som handlade om weird fiction-författaren och Lovecraft-kollegan Clark Ashton Smith. Och 2015 så dog Smiths nära vän William Farmer. Året innan så hade jag precis missat hans föreläsning med 5 minuter på Lovecraft-festivalen. Jag hade en premiär på min egen film då vid tillfället. Och när det hela var över och jag kom dit så stod St. Joshi där och var helt lyrisk över alla anekdoter han hade fått höra av William Farmer. William var död, men hans bror Noel Farmer lever och det är han som är i fokus i detta avsnittet och hans möten med Clark Ashton Smith och gamla Auburn och dess anekdoter.
I think Don Fryer and I are the only two guys still alive that actually knew Clark. And I was quite young, so...
Ja, inte riktigt. Smiths styvson, William Dorman, som nu förvaltar Smiths litterära arv, är också i livet. Och hans intervju i Darren Coelhos dokumentär om Clark Ashton Smith är så fullständig och klockren så det känns överflödigt att söka upp och intervjua honom. Han i alla fall var tillsammans med sin mamma de 2 sista timmarna och var den av de sista som såg Smith i livet, satt vid hans dödsbädd. Han berättar många anekdoter angående Smiths kläder, hans basker som han hade fått av George Sterling som ung och hans cigarettmunstycke som han rökte sina Pall Mall i. Någonting i alla fall som var helt unheard of att man hade ett cigarettmunstycke på den tiden. Hans militärbyxor med utsvängda sidor med stora fickor där han kunde ha alla sina verktyg när han skapade sina skulpturer i sten. Men nu tillbaka till Noel Farmer. As I've heard, everything started with your older brother getting to know Smith.
Well, my brother is 12 years older than me, so my brother became friends with him when he started at the local junior college. So that would have been about 1955 or I guess 56 or so, right around there. So, and then I got to know him through my brother, so it was probably 57 or 58 for me. And then Clark's, after he got married and moved to Pacific Grove, they used to come back. He and Carol would come back up on the weekends occasionally, and they stayed with us. I was only 6 years old, so I can't speak too much about my brother's friendship, except that I knew that he was friends with this guy who was kind of an oddball, and that he walked everywhere he went. He didn't own a car, didn't have a driver's license, and he dressed rather peculiarly. Especially for a small, conservative sort of foothill town. Although Auburn was a much more open-minded, artistic kind of community in those days than it is today. Today, it's just a bastion of conservative assholes, frankly. But back in those days, we had a very respected little junior college, and a lot of really high-quality professors. There was a lot of literary guilds and people like that. So. And the town embraced, we had a traveling, sort of symphony that came to town periodically, and the ballet would come to town. It was really, for a small town, it was pretty astounding how much of the arts were going on there. And the community, kind of embraced oddballs. I mean, today he would be pretty much ostracized around Auburn. And in those days, that his presence and things, he was like the oddball, but nobody cared.
I heard Smith wasn't too popular around town, that people despised and even feared him.
Well, I think that was some of the people that, lived up in the vicinity, because he had this huge piece of property that the developers were getting their hands on and slowly over time cheated him out of it. Those are the people that, when you're living around someone like that and they're different, the natural reaction is to have fear of, people are afraid of things that are different. And I know for a fact from my brother that, my brother, I think, may have met him at one of the local bars, and got to know him through that. But there was also another character in town that I know my brother hung out with. And I've mentioned this in a previous interview, and I've talked to Scott Connors and, Ron Hilger, and they don't know very much about this guy, but there was a Austrian count that lived in Auburn and really kept to himself. But he was, I think he left at the breakout of World War I. He left Austria and somehow wound up in Auburn. And his name was Count von Haydenstreet. That's about all I remember. And I remember being at his house with my brother, probably when I was 7 or 8, and they were all sitting around and getting pretty lit. And I remember he picked up the phone on a bet and made a phone call, and there was somebody there that the Count had bet that he knew Alfred Hitchcock. And he picked up the phone at 11 o'clock at night and called Alfred Hitchcock and got him on the phone. And that sticks out in my mind because I remember that.
I don't quite follow you. Was the Count and his circle something that happened after Smith's lifetime?
Oh, no, Smith was part of that literary artsy group around town. There were several of these people that were friends with Smith, and the Count was one of them. But like I said, there doesn't seem to be a lot of evidence or information about that. So, mostly what I remember is the Count's property was somewhere out in that vicinity of where Clark grew up, in that neighborhood down the road, down on the Auburn Folsom Road. Christian Valley, I think, maybe that's the name of the place. I can't remember. But it's not really a community. But I know the Count had a gold mine on his property, which is probably had something to do with it. And I know I talked to Ron Hilger, and he said he and Scott found that mine a few years ago. They were out hiking that hillside, and they found remnants of it, and they went into it. But beyond that, that's about as much as anybody knows about that end of the story. Most of what I remember about Clark is I remember going for walks from him. We lived about a mile, maybe a mile and a half from where his property was. And at this point, he had been cheated out of his property by and large. But when they had come up from Pacific Grove, I went for walks with him a couple of times, and we'd walk out to his old property, and he was out there looking for stones to carve. Because I know a lot of his carvings, there's a railroad cut that came from the Transcontinental Railroad where they made a big cut in a hillside there. And he used to go down in that area, and he would take stones out of that area. And I think he had another place down in Newcastle or somewhere down in Lincoln that he gathered his stones as well, that he could go through because it was such a deep cut in the hillside. He was getting rocks that, were obviously thousands of years old.
Did you hear the story that they found a dinosaur skeleton outside of town, and that Smith hints that he had stolen a piece of it with the line, "Some of my sculptures were cut out of dinosaur steak"?
Oh yeah, that's right. That railroad cut. There's a dinosaur skeleton in that cut. That's right. I remember that now. But when I would go on walks with him, and again, I was very young, but he would start talking about the universe and all sorts of oddball things that were way beyond my comprehension at that time. And, he had kind of an enlarged cranium, if you will, and he would wear that beret, and then that cigarette holder that you've seen pictures of him with that cigarette holder was given to him by the Count. I remember that story because my brother thought that was really funny that once the Count gave him that cigarette holder, he used that all the time after that. But to me, he was like an alien. This guy who talked about these other universes, and it was pretty cool. I mean, here I am, very young, and I've always been a fan of fantasy and science fiction as long as I can remember. I mean, when I was a kid, the only movies I wanted to go see were sci-fi movies, and so it was fascinating, just to have him talk about this big picture ideas that were beyond, normal thought, particularly for someone who's young. It was very interesting. And, and like the stories about the happy hour, which is the bar that, he was there pretty much every afternoon. And I know my brother used to spend a lot of time in that bar with him.
Didn't he give you some kind of gift? A pack of crayons or watercolor set or something?
I had a colored pencil drawing that he gave me of a Martian. And I had that for up until probably 5 years ago. I sold it when all of this mania around him really started with the Eldridge Dark website. And it was a point I got somebody offered me enough money for it that I sold it. And I had 2 sculptures as well that I also sold. And there's pictures of that stuff on the Eldridge Dark. I did preserve them by putting those photos up. So they're on there. And last time I talked to Don Fryer, the first thing out of his mouth was, he says, "Do you still have that drawing of the Martian?" And I sold the stuff to a guy in Chicago. I want to say Roy Squires is the name. Does that ring any bells to you? Okay. But he was a collector. And I'm sorry I sold the stuff now. I have one book that was published posthumously that Don was the editor on. And I have that book, and that was given by Don to my mother. So Don signed that, but I don't have any of Clark's stuff. And I brought my brother into this. He had no idea about this stuff going on. And, he got in touch with our Scott Connors and Ron Hilgers got in touch with my brother, and they made a trip down there and interviewed my brother. And they went through all of the stuff that my brother had accumulated that was given to him. And that's where they found the unpublished book, which my brother then published and edited. That was one of his stories, kind of the Arabian Nights stories. I think he wrote when he was like 14. And they found some other parts of some other books that had never been published. And I know ultimately my brother sold off pretty much all of his stuff to the Bancroft Library at UC Berkeley to make sure it would be preserved. And, obviously he needed the money too, so. But at least the stuff is preserved. And I know that the library at UC Berkeley, you could obviously go in and ask to see the stuff. Or periodically, I know last year they had a lot of it out on display.
What did Clark Ashton Smith and your brother do together when they hung out?
They used to do a lot of readings together where, they would take the various characters and take turns, reading his works, in particular his poetry. At that point in his life, the short stories and different worlds of those short stories, if you will, were not really of his interest anymore. He was strictly into poetry, and mostly at that point in his life, he was into his carvings. That's what I remember him. In fact, I remember him being in our house working on some of his carvings. But I know that, their habit was to get together, and they would drink cheap Burgundy, Loomis Burgundy. I remember that. It was 99 cents a gallon. And they would eat dark rye bread and stuff like that, and probably get thoroughly drunk and do readings of Clark's works. I think, when he was writing that stuff for those magazines back in the 20s, 30s, 40s, the impression I always got from my brother is that he did that just to put food on the table. That, he was always mostly interested in his poetry, but, poetry doesn't sell like a good story does. and you look at the price of those magazines from those days at 15 or 20 cents, that was a pretty expensive magazine. When a comic book was a nickel and you wanted, a sci-fi zine, it was 20, 25 cents sometimes. That was a lot of money in the Depression. Yeah, because you could go to a movie theater for a nickel.
When I was in Auburn, I talked to Ed Anker, who was a kid in the 50s, and then he and his friends used to play in Smith's abandoned cabin.
I hiked on the property. There wasn't much of it left by the time I got to know him. I think it was I can't remember what year it was burned down, but it was burned allegedly by Mr. Harrington, who ultimately owned all of that property. As part of a way to get the last little bit, because over time, as I said, he had somehow bought the property from Clark and cheated him. Clark was not very wise in the ways of the world at all. And I know one of the stories was about him losing that money. I don't know if you've ever heard that story, but he was paid off in cash, and somehow he lost the money. And there was, since it was paid in cash, there was no way to go put a claim or anything into it. But he lost the money, and it's just, I think he lived in those worlds is the only explanation I can come up with. I mean, I don't know how else a brain can come up with stuff that crazy, that fantastic, especially in such a different time than what we live in today, where we sort of take this for granted. I mean, it's, the popularity of science fiction today and fantasy is at an all-time high. And, for me, most of what's out there today, especially coming out of Hollywood, is just garbage. And I've never really understood. I mean, I know a lot of Clark's stories have been ripped off over the years. But why someone doesn't take some of that and try to turn it into a decent piece of science fiction. I mean, there's every time I see even a pretty good film, I see a lot of his ideas that I read years and years and years ago that have been incorporated into some of that stuff. But, just in such a loose manner, but it's just like there's somebody obviously had read it or knew something about him, and they took that and put it into some kind of a quick production piece. But like I watched a thing last night on Amazon Prime, and it was a story about discovering extraterrestrial life within our solar system. And there were these 3 spheres that had been kind of a 2001, if you will, like the monolith, except these were spheres. And they were placed on moons of Jupiter or Uranus. And they sent this astronaut on this, suspended stasis journey to go out there and get these things and figure out what it was. And it was a super low budget film. I mean, the set was terrible. The acting was terrible. But the story was interesting. And then they get to the end of the story and there's no end. All it was is that they discovered they came from someplace outside the universe, and the astronaut made an independent decision to put himself into stasis and head out in that direction for 32 years. And that was the end of the movie. And I'm going, well, okay, we didn't resolve anything, other than that we verified there was some other intelligent life out there. So, I just think of some of his worlds, and that would make a great series, to develop something around some of those ideas.
When you went on your walks with Smith, what was he doing? Was he just taking a walk for exercise?
Well, he was up there. Oh, I think I mentioned that he was looking for rocks. Those soft stones that were in that cut where the railroad came through, and he also wanted to just go back to his property. And I think it was maybe because Carol was there, so maybe he wanted to get away from Carol. I know after he died, Carol stayed with us for probably 3 or 4 weeks. And we had to have her committed to a mental hospital. And she went voluntarily. But my mother worked at the mental hospital, and she brought one of the doctors over to look at Carol. And he said he recommended that she go in, and she voluntarily committed. So I don't remember much more about Carol than all that my mother, my brother, and other friends that would come by were talking about how she kind of went off the deep end after Clark died. So that would have been 61. So I was 11 then. But I remember it was weird because she was staying with us, and I remember she was taking about 6 or 8 showers a day. But I know that my brother after they moved to Pacific Grove, my brother used to go down there periodically and stay down there for a few days with him. And I think that's one of my brother's pictures that he had, was taken at Pacific Grove with him. I'm going to try and make a trip down to Corpus Christi in the next few months and go see my sister-in-law. And I want to go through whatever crap she still has down there, because my sense is there may still be a lot of stuff there that she just doesn't really know what it is or doesn't care. And there's also some other family things there that my brother had that I would like to get my hands on as well, that I know are there. And, I'm sure she doesn't know what to do with them. I mean, she's pretty delighted to be rid of my brother, and I don't blame her. So that's my family dirty laundry.
Smith was a frequent visitor of the pubs in town in Auburn, and when I was in Auburn, Ron Hilger and Scott Connors and Darren Coelho and Ed Anker showed me a lot of these places. One of them was the Happy Hour, a place that Smith used to visit, at least when he had money.
Well, if you were there, what you said a couple of years ago, so they took you over to what was the Shanghai. It's now a brew pub. I grew up with the kids in the family. That place was owned by the same family for 130 years. I mean, it was since the last time that the town burned down. And the Yun family, Y-U-E-N. And I went to high school with one of them. And when I was in this time frame, my father was still alive. And we used to go down there get Chinese takeout food. And when you get Chinese takeout food, they would put 100 firecrackers in your takeout food. And there was a bar on one side, a restaurant on the other side, and there was illegal gambling, poker in the back. And if you went downstairs, there was a hidden door that went into a passageway that went underground tunnel up that hillside to the opium dens that were underneath all the Chinese houses.
En annan debatterad grej är det här om Smith verkligen använder någon form av psykedelika i sitt liv. Han har ju ständigt förnekat det, bortsett från sitt hemmabryggda vin. Och det finns faktiskt en anekdot som Ron Hilger berättade, som Margie Hill i sin tur hade berättat för honom, när hon och hennes mamma var och besökte Smith en gång. Och när de kom hem till Smith så var han helt väck i huvudet och okontaktbar, så att de fick gå hem igen. Och då hade Margie Hill sagt att hon trodde att han var påverkad av opium, men Ron Hilger att liksom, vad visste hon om det? Det känns rätt osannolikt. Eftersom när jag besökte Auburn så visade Ed Anker och Hilger och Scott mig opiumhålorna i marken under stan. Så att varför skulle det vara så långsökt att Smith hade rökt opium när det fanns tillgång till det i staden?
You can't get down there anymore. But when the Shanghai was being remodeled into that brew pub, I'm going to guess 7 years ago, I happened to be passing through Auburn. And I stopped at the old Tsuda grocery store, which I know is a place Clark used to go. And it had been converted into a restaurant, but that was owned by a Japanese family forever. And I stopped by just in case they were still there because I was friends with them for all those years. And that's when I discovered it had been changed. But I saw that they were remodeling the place across the street. And so I went into the Shanghai and it was all stripped down to bare wood, except for the tin ceiling. It was all that was left. And I went up to one of the contractors and I said, is it possible I could go downstairs? And he says, no. He says, we got that all blocked off. You can't do that. I said, did you find anything interesting when you were down there? And he says, well, what do you mean? I said, did you find a door that seemed to be hidden? And he said, yes. And I said, did you open it? And he says, yes. And it was a caved in tunnel. So I agree with you. It's entirely possible because that thing was certainly active up until World War II, because there was illegal gambling all over Auburn, and it continued for a short while after World War II. So it certainly is. Those opium dens I know were still active. And here's another piece of that story for you. When I was young, this is after Clark was dead, so it would be 63 or 64. You know, when I'm a young teenager and I don't have a car, but I had nothing to do. And a friend of mine and I decided to go gold pan that creek that runs through there. And there were a few buildings there that had burned down over the years and never were rebuilt. And we were back there digging around in that creek and we were screening the soil before we would pan it. And when we started screening the soil, we found hundreds of opium bottles. And they all had come out of those opium dens. People had come out of there and thrown the bottles in the creek. So we made more money selling the opium bottles to the antique stores than we ever did finding gold. You know, that in a Chinese community, that's a pretty open secret, you know, that the Chinese like opium. And I've never ever used opium, but from what people I know who have, they told me that the high from smoking opium is your dreams, and that you fall asleep and you have fantastic dreams. And I don't know, if in my mind, if you put two and two together, it's pretty easy to see in his stories that those could have been opium dreams.
Did you read Smith's work at the time when you knew him?
Well, I tried reading the stuff when I was young because my brother had all those books, and they were hard. They were hard for somebody when you don't have anything beyond a third or fourth grade education. He's pretty hard to read, and he's pretty hard to read for somebody with a big vocabulary. And I think that probably has certainly contributed to him never really being a commercial success, as opposed to his contemporaries, who obviously, H.P. Lovecraft became a huge success, of course, after he's dead. But, his stories are all over the place, or adaptations thereof. So my brother had this huge library of all his books. So I tried to read them. And I guess, I think I probably started really getting into stuff. It would have been when I was in college, when the Ballantine paperbacks came out, because my brother had all the books. And at that point, I didn't have any of the stuff other than, the sculpture and the drawing.
There was a lot of stories, or legends, if you will, from people walking by Smith's cabin, seeing strange things going on. Have you heard these stories?
Well, I mean, there is that story about him casting lightning about, sort of like Mickey Mouse in Fantasia. Who knows what he was doing? That might have been one of his opium trips. I don't know. That's one of those things. Somebody saw him doing something, and, it turned into rumors, and, that he's a devil worshiper and all this other stuff. And I know when I lived in San Francisco, I think it was Donald took me over to Anton LaVey's house. And I remember we had a conversation there because Anton liked to talk about the fact that he knew Clark Ashton Smith. And I know from some of the stuff my brother had told me is that Clark thought Anton LaVey was a complete fraud and didn't like him. And there is a photograph of Anton visiting him in Auburn at one point in time. But with that kind of stuff, you have a guy who is a devil worshiper coming to visit a resident of your town. You can imagine what comes out of that with local gossip.
So there was a picture of LaVey and Smith together.
Yeah, there is a picture of them. Yeah, I've seen it. And I can't remember. I think there was some other literary figure with him. I can't remember who it was. But this would have been, I don't know, I want to say it was the 30s or 40s maybe. It was when Anton LaVey was first, getting his deal going, his Church of Satan or whatever the hell he called it. I don't know. San Francisco, I don't know today. I don't know if San Francisco is like it was, but when I lived there for a couple of years in college, it was a fantastic place, and it has always been a city very tolerant of people who have different ideas and different opinions. And I'm not sure that exists too much in San Francisco anymore, because all these wealthy technology people have just taken over the city.
Can you remember any other stories about Smith that you heard from his circle of friends?
Ethel Heipel was a dear friend of our family, and she was part of his inner circle along with the Sullys and that group. And, there's always the stories that I'm sure you've heard that, he was pretty busy with the women around town, married and otherwise. So they were his benefactors, if you will. And I think Don patterned a lot of his life after that, in that Don was a pretty good sponge. And I think Clark, he traveled around town quite a bit, walking, of course. And I think, a lot of it was in the middle of the day. And, the suspicion is he was visiting a lot of the women around town, while the husband's working, he's servicing them. So, and especially if you're a member of that sort of literary circle, Auburn, if you think of it, had a university women's club, in a time when few women went to college. And unless you were going to become a nurse or a teacher, there wasn't a career path for women to go to college. But there were quite a lot of educated women in Auburn. And so I know he was in that circle of those women. An enviable position for a man.
Can you remember when you first became aware of this so-called Clark Ashton Smith mania and collectors buying Smith stuff for thousands of dollars?
Oh, you mean the current level, which is really nothing in the big picture. But it started when I stumbled across the Eldritch Dark, which has got to be, that's 16 years ago, probably. Early part of this century, and I stumbled across that because I was looking for some information on Clark for some reason. I don't remember why. And I stumbled across that website, and I went, my God, these people are all over the world, and they're eating this stuff up. And it's like, I had no idea. I mean, to me, it was like, his one stab at fame was, 10 years after he was dead, when they started publishing his stuff in paperback. And that was the only time I think he had ever gotten any kind of exposure outside of a very, very small group of fans that probably got introduced to him because they were Lovecraft fans. And I sort of had hopes that, geez, here's this guy that I knew, and his stuff's in paperback now. Maybe it'll take off. And that actually, when his stuff came out in paperback, that's when Heinlein's Stranger in a Strange Land was very hot with my generation. So, and Frank Herbert's Dune, which is really truly a fantasy book. And that stuff was very popular with the college age group. So I had hopes that, hey, here, because I remember I was at a bus stop somewhere on the Oregon coast, and I walk in and here's this copy of Zothique. And I'm like, what the hell is this doing here in a bus station? And then it just died out. There were never any second editions published or anything. And then, these guys, Scott and Ron, actually moved to Auburn, and I started following the stuff on there. And that's when I told my brother, I said, hey, there's this whole movement out there that's, all over this stuff. And he had no idea at all. So, I put him onto the website, and I said, here's these two guys, that are living in Auburn. And I said, chase these guys down. And then they made a connection. And that's kind of how the other, the unpublished works came about.
Ja, det var allt för den här gången. Mitt namn är Henrik Möller. Musiken är skapad av Testbild. Hej då.